Welcome to the 2019 ACFW at Home Conference. I'm Barbara Britton, and today I'm going to share with you how I keep readers turning pages, and we'll talk a little bit about scene and sequel. And I'm very happy to be here. This is my first time at the At Home Conference, so I appreciate you joining me and listening to what I have to say. As I tell my critique partner Betsy when we exchange pages, use what you like, discard the rest, because authors, we do things in different ways and there's different strokes for different folks. So I am in Wisconsin and it happens to be a little gloomy today. I'm married to an ordained minister who works in information technology, and I have two boys who are in their 20s. One is in seminary and one is in the military. And I started writing in 2007. I knew nothing about how to craft a novel or how to publish a novel. So it took me until 2015 to actually get a book contract. So I had a lot of learning to do. And so I'm going to share some things that I learned along the way to publication and share what I've learned after publication with all the at-home folks on Facebook. I think we have a Facebook group later that I will jump on and answer any questions about today's talk or about publishing in general. But before I begin, I just want to say that there's a few books I'll be referencing, or people's ideas that I'll be referencing today. One book I really enjoy is a book called Story by Robert McKee. And we'll talk about what he says about an inciting incident, how to begin your story. But this is a great book about movies and stories that I've really enjoyed. I also like Deborah Dixon's Goal, Motivation, and Conflict. I don't have a copy of that book, but that's what we'll be talking about later on when we do Scene and Sequel. And Jack M. Bickham, Scene and Structure. Did I get that right? That's another book that helps me move my story along chapter by chapter. And then I'll also talk about some plotting. And Michael Haig is known for The Hero's Journey. I've heard him speak a couple times, and he's got a lot of interesting videos on YouTube just about plot and writing screenplays and story. So those are some of the books and people I will be referencing today that have really helped me learn how to craft a novel, how to keep it going, how to keep a reader's interest. So I just want to say before I start all my writing that I pray. I pray that I will write the best that I can, that God will help me to do that. And at night, I pray for creativity, because when I'm crafting books, sometimes I do get stuck and I need my creative juices to get flowing. So I ask God to help me with that. So I love the fact that we're in Christian fiction and that we present a Christian worldview, and that we can pray and encourage one another on this publication journey. So one thing we're going to look about today is I brought my son's Thomas engine and cars, and we're going to look at our books as a train. And you can tell that I don't clean out closets because my kids are in their 20s and I still have their Thomas trains. But what we're going to look at first is plotting. So we're going to look at the whole entire train. And Michael Haig says that there's basically 4 plot lines. And what's interesting about plot is it kind of gears toward genre. So if you go to Barnes & Noble, if you go into the Christian fiction section, most of us are just listed alphabetically because it's usually a smaller section. But if you go into the mainstream area of Barnes & Noble, you will see that they have the romance all to themselves, they have mysteries all to themselves, they have thrillers all to themselves, so they group by genre. So you kind of have to know what type of story you're writing. What train are you going to craft? And so Michael Haig says there are basically 4 types of plots. So there's your to-win novel. If you're writing a romance, it's in the to-win category. Now, in Christian fiction, we know that a man or a woman can't be our be-all, right? That Jesus Christ can only fill our hearts. So we write Christian romance differently than they do in mainstream. But also, your competitions are in the to-win plotline category. So To Win the Football Game. The Pitch Perfect movies were about winning a singing competition. And then if you look at TV, we have a ton of to win programs out there. The Bachelor, not my fave. We also have to win the singing competition with The Voice or American Idol. We have to win the dance competition with Dancing with the Stars or So You Think You Can Dance. So if your book is about winning a competition or winning the love of your life, that is a to win story. We also have a to stop plot line, Michael says, and this would be to stop something bad from happening. So these are where your horror books would be, your sci-fi, your thrillers, your murder mystery, because we're looking to stop the terrorists. We're looking to stop the murderer, the stalker, and so those books are to stop. And then we have our escape books, or I call overcoming books. We need to escape poverty or a bad situation, or we need to escape prison, a physical structure. Those are your to escape novels. And then he says we have these retrieve plot lines. We have to go and get something or someone. So all the Taken movies with Liam Neeson, he's going to retrieve his kidnapped daughter, or somebody has to find something. So these are heist movies. We're going to go find or retrieve the diamonds. And so Michael Haig basically says there's 4 plot lines out there. Kind of figure out where your story fits in these plot lines, and this will be your entire train. Your main character is going to go on a journey, and he's going to have a goal, and it's going to be either to win, to stop, to escape, or to retrieve. And you're going to craft a novel that gets him from point A, your engine, to point C, your caboose. So those are some ideas of plot lines that Michael Haig talks about. And you should have that idea before you start writing down, what is my book going to be? Where is it going to be shelved in a bookstore? Also, before we get into crafting the train cars, train car by train car, we're going to look at our engine. Our engine is very important because it drives our train. And if our engine gets off track, then our train isn't going to go very far. So the opening to a book, the opening to your novel, the first chapter is very important. And there are a lot of books out on Amazon that will talk about how to craft your first 5 pages or your first chapter. I know this is very important because in one of the pitches I did to an agent, she liked my book. She said, send me a query letter and 1 page, your first page. And I was a little shocked. Nobody had ever asked me for 1 page. They'd asked me for a partial, which is your first 3 chapters, or a full, which is your entire manuscript. But nobody had ever asked me for 1 page. So she could tell whether she wanted my book or whether I could write an opening to a novel on just 1 page, which was kind of new to me. But there's a few things that people do that I have seen when I have judged contests that will derail your train, derail your engine if you happen to do these in the first chapter. And they also are very off-putting to your readers. So the first one I have coined the Marco Polo mistake. Where am I? So if you've played in the pool, Marco Polo, you're trying to locate somebody. So a lot of time books start out and the reader doesn't know where the story is taking place. So they're confused because they don't know the setting. So in our first chapter, we want to make sure the reader knows where they are and what time of day is it. Now, in historicals, sometimes we date stamp London, 1847. So the reader knows where they are and what year. But it's up to us as the author to make sure we bring London alive with the senses, the sights, the smells, the sounds, the color. What does London feel like? So we need to clue our reader in to where our setting is going to be. Now, I happen to judge a few contests, and one of them, I was reading the opening to a book, and it was set in a bar. Now, that's probably not an ACFW contest. But I didn't know whether the bar was a pub in New England or a sports bar in Miami. And those would be two different feels, two different settings for the novel. And you could do so much as an author with setting the stage well, but there was nothing about the setting. So watch the Marco Polo mistake. Make sure your reader knows where they are, what time of day it is. The other thing that I have seen in the openings of novels that can derail our engines are the Brady Bunch opening. Okay, we see too many characters in the opening chapter, and so your reader gets confused. Even in the Brady Bunch opening, we know that she has 3 daughters and that he has 3 sons, but we don't name them all. So be very careful in your opening chapter that you limit it to the main characters, the important characters, so your reader can get attached to your main character and not be confused by too many people coming through in the opening pages. I, as a reader, don't like to be confused and keep track of a ton of people. I have judged manuscripts where I have been, introduced to every band member and their instruments and what they look like. I've also been walked through a store and met every clerk, and it gets very confusing because I don't even know then who the main character really is. So watch that you really hone in on your main character, important characters in the opening of a novel. One thing I will say from experience is I write biblical fiction. I'm published in biblical fiction, and sometimes I'm stuck with really hard to pronounce names or names that I cannot change. But in my debut novel, I had my hero is Gilead, and in the first chapter, you meet the heroine's brother, Gershom. Now, I thought those names were different enough, but my editor said, Barb, you're going to have to change one of these because when I see that G, I keep thinking of Gilead, and it's this other guy speaking. So I had to change Gershom to Shimron so that nobody would get confused about the names. So watch similar sounding names. I read a book one time where there was a Pearson and a Perkins, and they both had government jobs, and one of them actually was the bad guy, but I was so confused by these 2 characters, it just kind of fell flat at the end of the novel. So watch the naming of your characters and watch the Brady Bunch opening. Another thing to think about in your opening chapters is make sure you do not do the driver's license opening, or what I say is no mirror moments, where a character describes themselves in entirety. Hair color, eye color, height, weight, sweetheart face. Most of us don't think about ourselves like a driver's license. So it's best to sprinkle in what your character looks like instead of doing an info dump in the first chapter, exactly what your character looks like. No driver license openings. And most of the time, if someone picks up a book, especially in biblical fiction where you have a woman, usually in a hair covering, they already have an idea what your character looks like because your publisher has put information you give them about your character on the front of the book. And so a reader will always have a good idea of what your character looks like. You don't need to do the mirror moment and give them the driver's license description of your main character. So watch that in your engine because we want it to stay on track. One other thing I would say in the opening chapters to watch out for is information dumping. So on a train, we want our train to go forward and we don't want it to go backward. So make sure that when you start your story that it's going forward, and we don't want to look too much to the rear. So resist the urge to explain. No info dumping. So we start a story, we want to keep going forward and be in the here and now. You might have to sprinkle in some backstory, but no paragraphs of backstory in the opening. It will slow your pacing, and because your reader doesn't know your character, they don't care about the backstory. So once they know and care and have an emotional tie to your character, then they will care what happened to them in at the prom or in high school, but not right now. So be very careful. I see a lot of openings where I'm going along and the story's great, and then we get paragraphs or pages of stuff that happened years ago, and it just kills the progress of your train and the progress of your novel. So your engine is very, very important. So how do I start a novel? I start it with my main character doing something in their ordinary world. And so you have your main character and they're in the setting. People know where they are. And it doesn't have to be that they're doing something like hanging from a helicopter, or there has to be bullets flying. In some genres, maybe that's an opening. But in like biblical fiction, I have my characters getting ready to go out and dance at a festival, or they're going out to collect manna. This is something active in their everyday life. It doesn't have to be fast and furious action. But my main character is doing some action, and then something happens. Now, Robert McKee calls this the inciting incident. So something is going to happen to change your character's life forever. And it's going to set them on this long journey. It's going to take them from the beginning of the train to the end of the train so that they reach their goal. And so the inciting incident could be anything. It could be a phone call from an attorney that your uncle has died and left you a dude ranch in Oklahoma. But you're a high-powered New York lawyer on deadline. You now have to go to Oklahoma. That's an inciting incident. Someone has died and left you a dude ranch. You get a letter from the IRS that you owe $100,000 and they've added all these penalties, but it's your ex-husband's company. So then you find out that, what if he's not your ex-husband? What if you're still married? That sets you on this journey, right? This inciting incident. Or someone shows up at the door. This is the child you gave up for adoption 18 years ago, and you haven't told your husband that you had a child. So something happens, this inciting incident, to upend your main character's life and set them on this journey. So that is the inciting incident. That all happens in the first chapter. So your character is going to have this goal. The inciting incident is basically going to set them on that goal. And each chapter, each train car is going to have little goals of their own. And we're going to get into that in just a moment about how I keep my story going chapter after chapter after chapter. But usually every chapter has a goal, and your character will get that goal or won't. And most of the time your character's not going to get it. So they're going to get a no, and furthermore, there's going to be extra problems heaped on your character. Sometimes your character can get their goal, but then there's strings attached. You don't always want your character to get their goal because it ends your book. So I happen to be judging a contest where this guy needed a job. He had health bills he had to pay, and he wanted this job with a tycoon. So he goes in and he interviews and he gets the job with a tycoon. That seems wonderful, but you've just ended your story because his goal was to get this job to pay his medical bills, and he gets the job. So there's no more story. So basically that entry ended at chapter 1. I changed it a little, so, don't think I'm making these writers uncomfortable. But what you could do with that scenario is he goes in, the tycoon says, you have the job, but here's some things you have to do to prove you're worthy. What do we have then? The Devil Wears Prada, where Anne Hathaway goes in, she wants to be the assistant, but she has to do these extremely hard tasks in a short amount of time. So that is, yes, you've gotten your goal, but there's strings attached. And then we have a movie, then we have a plot where she's going on to see if she can get whatever strings are attached to the yes. And also, no furthermore is setting your character further on their journey because they have to come up with ideas of how to eventually get their goal with this roadblock that you've put up for them. So I'm going to show you a notebook that I have of my writing. Now, when I started high school, I put in that I wanted to type, right? I wanted a typing class. And I was one of 2 freshmen put in biology. So you'll notice that I do not type well, right? Never learned to type. So all my manuscripts are on notebooks like this, and I write longhand. And I usually write neater than this, but when I'm writing, I can decipher my chicken scratch. But at the top of the page, I do something that Deborah Dixon and Jack Bickham talk about to get us from train car to train car to train car. And I have a little poster about that. So Deborah Dixon talks about your character having a goal for each scene that has to be well motivated, and then always conflict. And that usually comes at the end of a chapter to drive the reader to the next chapter. We call that like a cliffhanger. Jack Bickham does the same thing as Deborah Dixon. He says every chapter has to have a goal, and there's got to be conflict, because we know conflict and tension drive a novel. And then you have a disaster. So they both end with something usually bad happening to your character, so that the reader will want to turn the page. And then Jack Bickham says you also have to think of how your character is going to react to that disaster. They have to make a decision to keep going forward, but there's always dilemma. There's always roadblocks. There's always hardship. There's always an emotional cost. So both Deborah Dixon and Jack Bickham agree that each chapter that you write, each train car, has to have its own goal, its own motivations, conflicts, and then end with this big disaster. No, you don't get your goal, and furthermore, there's strings attached. There's a cost to pay. There's a ticking clock. And so this drives the story forward. So when I think about putting together my books, so this is actually a notebook from a book that's not even out yet, because I'm just starting a series on the daughters of Zelophehad in October. So this is the second book that follows Noah, who's not Noah in the ark, but Noah, a daughter of Zelophehad. And you'll notice that at the very top of my page, I have a GMCD. So I know I'm going to put down the goal for this chapter, the motivations behind my character and other characters, and the conflicts and disasters that happen. Now, you'll notice I also have reboot chapter 1. So sometimes you start a book and you think, well, I need to do this better, or it's not quite right, and you can reboot it. So just remember, first drafts aren't perfect. We always have to come back and work on our novels. But here I have my main character, Noah, is a shepherdess, right? And this is right before the fall of Jericho, where the Israelites are coming into the land of Canaan. So her goal is basically to take care of her flocks, because this is her essence. She's a shepherd. She's good with animals. And the motivation is that she wants her sisters and her to have wealth through animals. She wants to prove also that she's as good as the men, because a lot of people look down on her because she's a woman, and there's a threat that they might pull her from the fields and send her into camp. So she wants her flocks to be fruitful and multiply. There's always conflict because she's a woman in a man's world. And then in the opening, the walls of Jericho fall. And that's great for the Israelite army as they go in to conquer Jericho. But a woman with a whole bunch of animals in the field, when the ground starts to shake, we have our disaster, or our last conflict, page-turning disaster, and that is the animals stampede. So all her wealth, all her animals are racing into the unconquered land of Canaan. And then we end chapter 1. So I have my goal, my motivations, and my conflict disaster that I have to show in this chapter. Then I go on, of course, to the next chapter. And this, I have another scene, but I also have a little bit of a, what we call sequel, is what Jack Bickham calls this reaction, dilemma, decision. And that is that I have a goal for Noah. Number one, she wants to stay alive because there's all these animals racing, ox, cattle, and she wants to make sure those young boys and other shepherds are safe because people's lives matter. And the motivation is that she loves these people around her, but she also loves her animals, right? And then a conflict for Noah in this chapter is that she's going to have to go out and find her animals. And this is not a land that has been conquered yet, so there's also enemies out there. But her reaction to all this is she can't believe that the animals are stampeding. She's scared, but she has to act because one of the other shepherds has just gone where he can't move. And then this is a dilemma for her as a woman to go out into Canaan. Will they let her even go out alone, or does she have to take her escort? Of course, her escort is the hero, but he, who is another shepherd, is going to be the love interest, but he is deaf and mute. And if I knew I was going to do a series, I would not have made a character deaf and mute, but you know, some things aren't thought out when you're an author. And then there's a dilemma and decisions that have to be made about her going out to retrieve the animals. And she does. She goes out with Jeremiah, they part, and then she finds some of her sheep that have been stolen by these Canaanites, and she's alone. And these Canaanite men are looking at her like they'd like to tie her up and put her with the sheep. And she can't call to Jeremiah. Of course, he's deaf, so here is your big disaster. She's going to have to see if she can battle these idol-worshiping pagans of Canaan. And the chapter ends. So that is how I kind of work. Then we go on to the next chapter. Her goal, I got to defeat these Canaanites. And it goes on. Why motivations? What are the conflicts? You know. So that's how I do a scene and sequels throughout my novel, is to go forward and keep thinking of the little goals that are going to be in my book. And I have a main goal for my whole novel. So that's a little bit of the nuts and bolts of how you keep a story going, is looking at the individual scenes and sequels for goals, motivation, conflicts. You have to put in their reactions, their decisions, but usually there's a dilemma involved. And really bring your character into the chapter by chapter journey of your character. Early on when I was writing, my critique partner Betsy used to tell me, Barb, what is the point of this scene? We love our characters, we want to hang with them, but there has to be a point to the chapter. Why is this chapter in your book? And it has to be moving your train forward. It can't stall. If it stalls on the track, the reader gets bored and throws the book up against the wall. Or they go on to another book, or it sits there until they decide they want to pick it up again. So we want to keep moving our trains and our stories forward. So also, I will talk about scene and sequel in a book called The Hunger Games, which I know is a little controversial because it's not Christian fiction. But it's a book that I read many, many years ago, and I still remember the opening to that book. So I'm going to talk about that with scene and sequel and goals and conflicts and reactions, but I'll do that after I sign off. So if you don't want to hear about that book, I understand that. You can just end my portion here, and you don't have to listen to me talk about The Hunger Games. So I am happy. I will be on Facebook answering any questions about what we've talked about today, about how to open a novel, about things to look out for in a novel, about getting goal motivations and conflicts into any chapter. I'm happy to answer questions about my publishing journey, marketing, my writing, anything that you want to ask me on Facebook, I am happy to answer. I have a wedding the weekend of the conference, so I won't be on all the time because wedding and reception will be fun. But I'll try and be on there as much as I can to answer any questions you have about this workshop, or any questions you have about the craft side of writing or the publishing side of writing, because those are things that I had no knowledge about when I finished my first book. So I thank you all for joining me for this workshop. I hope it's been helpful. Remember, use what you like, trash the rest, and I will see you on our at-home conference Facebook discussion page. So thanks so much for joining me. Okay, so those that have turned off have turned off. I know the book, The Hunger Games, is a little controversial, but as I said, it's an opening that stuck with me for years. And it's great: goal, motivation, conflict, disaster, reaction, decision, dilemma. So how do we open The Hunger Games? It's a young adult book. It's dystopian, so it happens in the future. So Suzanne Collins does a great job of setting you in District 12, which is called the Seam, in this futuristic, I guess it's America. So she does a great job of setting. And then we meet our main character, Katniss Everdeen. And we meet people that are very important to the story, her mother and her sister. So I usually tell people, don't open a chapter with people in bed, but it works for her because this is the day of the reaping, and we know that something ominous is happening. So she raises some questions, and she gets us on that hook. So The Hunger Games, some people might say, is a to-win plot. Katniss has to win the Hunger Games. But if that was the plot, then we'd only have one book, and we have a 3-book series. So really, the plot line of The Hunger Games is to escape. It's to escape the oppression of the Capitol that has Katniss and her family starving and barely surviving day to day. So this is an escape novel, and really, Katniss and her family are not going to escape that day-to-day survival until the Capitol is overthrown. So that's why we have 3 books instead of just the one. During her chapter-to-chapter crafting of this book, Suzanne Collins has to make a goal of Katniss to survive the Hunger Games, but that's not the end-all goal. So we know this is a book to escape, because Suzanne Collins, the goal of Katniss in the first chapter, and we see her taking care of her family. And we know that her younger sister is very important to her. So we have a goal that she is worried about her sister, who's 7 years old, and she's worried about her family, providing food for them. And actually, you can state the goal in your chapters. And that's what Suzanne Collins does. On page 15, this is a long for a first chapter because we are a dystopian. So she's really got to set the setting for us because we don't know District 12. We don't know the oppression or the revolution that happens. So it's going to be a little longer, her setting the stage for this book. But on page 15, Katniss Everdeen tells us her goal for this chapter and basically her life and for the whole 3 books. And she says on page 15, I protect Prim, which is her little sister, in every way I can, but I'm powerless against the reaping. And that we are in the day of the reaping, where they're going to choose one boy and one girl from District 12 to send to these horrific games where people all try and kill one another, and there's only one victor. So we know that's her goal. What is the motivation? Well, she loves her sister. She wants them to survive. We also have conflict in this opening chapter. We know something has gone on with the mother. Katniss is basically the parent in this chapter, not the mother. So we see little bits raising questions of this conflict with the mother. On page 15 again, Katniss will say about her mother, "I'm trying to get past rejecting offers of help from her. For a while, I was so angry I wouldn't allow her to do anything for me." So we know that there's something going on with the mother, conflict and tension. Why is Katniss going out to risk her life to get food for her family? Why isn't the mother stepping up? So that's the conflict in this opening chapter. And then we have disaster. Katniss Everdeen's goal is to protect Prim and basically her family, but Prim, her 7-year-old sister. It's the day of the reaping. They get ready to go, and what do you think happens at the end of chapter 1 to be a disaster for Katniss Everdeen? This is the last line of chapter 1. Effie Trinket crosses back to the podium, smooths the slip of paper, and reads out the name in a clear voice. And it's not me. It's Primrose Everdeen, her little sister. Disaster. We have Katniss's goal for this chapter is to protect her younger sister, protect her family. We've seen the motivation. She loves them. She wants to keep them alive, like all of us would, right? We see that there's conflict with the mother, and Katniss has had to step up into a role she really shouldn't have to, risking her life to go and kill game outside of the district, which could cost her her life. And in this first chapter, we find out that the father got blown up in a mine disaster, and the mother went kind of loopy, and that's when Katniss had to assume responsibility. Now, goal, motivations, conflict to beat the band, and then we have this disaster. The worst thing that can happen to Katniss does. Her sister's name is pulled. Now, what is she going to do? Chapter 2, we have a reaction, and it's shown how she reacts. She can't breathe. She's like in shock. The reaction that it was her sister, you know. So then she has a decision to make. And what is the decision? I volunteer as tribute. She volunteers in her sister's place to go to the Hunger Games where they're going to be trying to kill each other, right? There's only one victor. And this is all punishment from the capital to all the districts. So that's why really Katniss's family can't escape their starvation and their oppression until we have a revolution. So that's why we have 3 books, and it doesn't end after this one, because we don't have a revolution at the end of the first book of the Hunger Games. And then we have a dilemma. So her reaction is horrific, right? My sister's been chosen. This is the worst thing. My goal is basically to protect my sister. And then we have a decision. I volunteer as tribute. And then there's this dilemma, because who else has been chosen but Peeta Mellark? So who is Peeta Mellark, right? It shouldn't be, you know, anything off Katniss's skin off Katniss's nose. But we find out that after the father died and the mom just kind of lost it, her family was basically starving to death. And Katniss on one day thought they were all going to die. They were just starving so badly. Yet she walked out by Peeta Mellark's bakery. His father owns a bakery. And Peeta intentionally burned bread, got beaten by his mother, but he walks out, and instead of throwing that bread to the pigs or whatever, he throws it to Katniss. And that day she went home with food for her family and food for the next day. And then she decided they were going to live. It was kind of her, I can do this. And so Peeta, the boy that basically saved her and her family, is now going to the Hunger Games as the other tribute from District 12. And so it's this whole dilemma. And here's the dilemma at the end of chapter 2 that Katniss says, oh, well, I think there will be 24 of us in the Hunger Games. Odds are someone else will kill Peeta before I do. Of course, the odds have not been very dependable of late. So her dilemma is this guy that saved her family she might have to kill him in order to survive. And that's kind of a twist of fate. And so then the next chapter, we have goals. Again, she's going to go to the Capitol as one of the tributes from District 12. And she still has the overarching goal of taking care of her family, because she does say to her mother, you have got to step up now. I'm not going to be here. And she gets that commitment from her mother, right? And she has it all set up that they're going to be fine while she's gone. So her goal is still the same. And in this chapter, it's specific, letting the mother take the helm. And then we have the motivations why they still want to live and thrive. And we have conflict because now she's in the district and they're talking all about these games and so forth and so on. And the disaster at the end of that chapter, if you keep reading, is they get help from people in their district that have won before. And there's only one person that has won in District 12 before, and it's Hamish, and he's a drunk. So he's really not going to be that much of help. And at the end of the chapter, it's a disaster because he's supposed to be there engaged and helping them, and he just vomits all over the place. Disaster. So that's one of the openings that I have remembered for year after year. You can read, you don't have to buy the book. You could read the opening on Amazon, the first chapter, but she crafts the goal, motivation, conflict, disaster, and then the reaction, the decision, the dilemma that Jack Bickham talks about as a sequel. Just, it's right there in the book. And she drops in her conflict in little bits. We don't ever really go back for a whole backstory until chapter 2, when we need the backstory of PETA. And she does it in such a way as it's kind of a small flashback about why he means something to her. So anyway, that is the example of goal, motivation, conflict, disaster, and reaction, decision, dilemma that Deborah Dixon and Jack Bickham talk about in crafting your book to get the train cars moving forward. And so you know what chapter will come next in your book. So I hope this has been helpful. And I will see you on the At Home Conference Facebook pages. Thank you very much for joining me.